Hi folks, this is Rabbi David Foreman. Purim is right around the corner, so let's just fast forward to Purim night. There you are in synagogue. You're listening to the Megillah like you always do, and you're kind of bored. Reading the Purim story year after year sometimes feels just a little bit like being back in third grade again. You learned the story back in Mrs. Schwartz's class. Why do you have to hear it again every single year? But the truth is, the story you learned as a kid shouldn't really be the story you see as an adult. Even if you're a kid watching this, ask yourself, do you really want just the kids' version of the Megillah? Can't you handle more? As it happens, questions pervade the Megillah, obvious questions. Those questions I want to argue to you in this video series are windows. If we crawl through them, we'll be in a position to see the story in startling new ways. We'll be in a position to read the story as adults. Let's get to the questions in the Megillah, the obvious questions. You just have to clear your mind and try to see the Megillah as if you've never seen it before, and suddenly I think these questions will jump out at you. And where I'm getting at here is the idea that your familiarity with the Purim story will sometimes work against you. It can be hard sometimes when you know so well how Esther, Mordechai, the king, and Haman actually did behave. It's hard to imagine that they could have done things differently. But each of the Megillah's central characters surely could have. So what I want to do with you is this. Let's read through the story, but pause at strategic points in the story and think about the actions of these people. Let's place ourselves in the proverbial shoes of any of the major figures in the narrative and ask ourselves, if we were them right now, what would we do? When we arrive at an answer, we'll then continue reading and we'll just compare what we would have done with what that person actually did do. More often than not, I think we'll be surprised by the great chasm between what we expected to happen and what actually did take place. Let's begin with Esther. Esther acts boldly, she acts heroically, but she also acts kind of strangely, at least at face value. Let's fast forward to the moment that Haman has issued his decree. The Jews are in mourning, everything seems lost, everyone's going to die. Esther has until now succeeded in maintaining a secret. She's never told the king that she is Jewish. Mordechai now implores her to reveal this. She's got to go to the king. She has to beseech him to save her people. Esther initially refuses. It turns out that the king has sequestered himself for a while now in his private chamber. And that's a really inconvenient turn of events because, according to the law of the realm, anyone who enters the king's chamber uninvited takes his or her life in their own hands. Esther worries that it doesn't seem like a good time to risk such a visit to the king. It's been a month now since he's called to see her, and she fears that she's no longer in his good graces. Esther shares those misgivings with Mordechai, but he insists that she has to go to the king. So Esther gives in. She agrees to risk it all. She tells Mordechai that she and her ladies-in-waiting will undertake a prolonged 3-day fast, and after that she'll face the king, come what may. So the moment of truth arrives. Esther dresses up in royal clothes, and she dares to enter the king's chamber. He sees her, and then, amazingly, he lifts his scepter, indicating permission for her to enter. As she approaches, he tells her that he's going to grant whatever request she has, no matter what it is, up to half the kingdom, and it's hers. What do you need? He asks. Okay, stop right there. You play Esther. It's your move. What would you do? How would you reply to the king? I don't know about you, but if I were Esther, this is actually the moment that I would seize to make my request. Well, you see, king, it's very nice of you to offer half your kingdom, but actually I just require a small itty-bitty little favor. It seems that genocide has somehow been decreed against my people. Don't know how it happened, some sort of palace mix-up probably, but luckily it's so easy to reverse, king. If you wouldn't mind just signing right here, this little document I prepared, we can just undo that decree right now. I would be ever so grateful, king. Thank you so much. But that is not what Esther says. Instead, she asks the king to meet her and Haman at a banquet that she's going to make later on. Why does she do that? This was the moment. The king had lifted his scepter and offered to give her half the kingdom. She would have done anything just the day before to get a reception like that. Why does she squander the magic of the moment by postponing the reckoning for some later time? Is she ever going to get a better chance? Okay, so much for Esther. What about Haman? He's decided to wipe out the Jews once and for all on a single blood-soaked day. In order to do that, though, he needs the consent of the king. Now, before we look closely at what he says, let's just take a minute to contemplate what we might have said had we been in his shoes. What charge could you level against these Jews to incite the king's wrath and allow you to proceed with your murderous plot? I can think of a lot of things Haman could say. The Jews, they poison the wells. They bake the blood of Persian children into their matzah on Passover. You name it. Haman certainly doesn't feel himself constrained by the truth. As it happens, though, Haman says 3 things, and at least 2 of them seem entirely beside the point. Here are his complaints. A. The Jews are scattered throughout the Persian Empire. B. They observe their own laws, making them different from other nations. C. They don't keep the king's laws. Now, why on earth does he bother with the first 2? I mean, if I were Haman, I would have dropped those first 2 points and mentioned only the third. They don't keep the king's laws. I mean, that's the only thing the king's likely to care about. Think about it. He's basically arguing that the Jews are criminals. And, it's logical to argue that the Jews are criminals, because if they don't keep the laws of the realm, then you could certainly argue that they deserve to be done away with. But who cares about the first 2 things? Who cares where the Jews are located geographically? And who cares that they observe a set of laws that distinguish them from other peoples in the kingdom? The same could probably be said for every one of the king's 127 provinces. They all likely observe certain laws and customs that distinguish them from the others. The conquered people of India, in all likelihood they had different zoning laws than the people of Ethiopia, but is that grounds to do away with one or the other in a frenzied state-sponsored bloodbath? Presumably, though, Haman is not being foolish. He actually has a plan. He knows the king well, and the charges that he is making are most likely those that give him the greatest advantage. Our task is to figure out what he knew that we don't. So that's Esther, and that's Haman. Let's turn now to the king, King Ahasuerus. If you read the first 12 verses or so of the Megillah, you're going to find that they are all about the glory and grandeur of King Ahasuerus. We hear that the king was emperor of the world, sovereign over 127 provinces, stretching all the way from India to Ethiopia. We read about his lavish 180-day-long party, the riches, the fine linens, the gold, the delicately fashioned utensils. So had we been reading the royal archives of the Persian court, all that would be understandable, but we're not reading the archives of the Persian court. We're reading the Megillah, a Jewish book. Why do I need to know about all that splendor? Why start a book in the Bible with such a banal, extended digression? And let's talk about the king himself. Many readers of the Megillah perceive Ahasuerus as a naive, foolish guy. This perception arises in part from one of the very first moments in the Megillah, where the king seems to make this really impetuous decision regarding his queen, Vashti. At the end of this 180-day feast, he orders Vashti to be brought before the throngs and the multitudes, and here's the verse. He asked to have Vashti the queen brought before the king to show her beauty off to the nations and the princes, for indeed she was very beautiful. What exactly was the king thinking here? I mean, it seems crazy what he's doing. Putting your wife on display and inviting other men to marvel at her, it's just plain gauche. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing not just for the poor woman at the center of attention, but for all the men in attendance too. It's just not a very royal, refined thing to do. Why then did Ahasuerus do it? So you could say, look, maybe he wasn't a very refined person. Maybe he was drunk. And that is certainly possible, but I'd like to suggest perhaps there was a method to the madness of Ahasuerus. Perhaps if we take the time to understand things from Ahasuerus' point of view, we may well find that the king's course of action was not all that irrational after all. When we get around to answering all these questions that we've just now raised, I think we're going to see that the story of the Megillah is actually far more complex than it at first seems. It's not just about a genocidal villain with a bruised ego, or a beautiful queen who succeeds because she chances upon lucky situations, or even a goofy king who doesn't see what's happening right under his nose. As we venture through the story of Purim, we're going to actually use the questions we've asked in this video, these observations about the strangeness of each character's actions, to guide us. Why is everyone acting so strangely? What exactly is behind each of their plans? Join me as we explore these questions, seeking to uncover a richer understanding of the holiday, the Book of Esther, and the meaning of it all. Follow me into this next video.